else joins us. So welcome to the third traditional webinar of the Guild of Trainers in the frame of the project AppRaiser. What did you say, Tuesday? Yeah, it's Tuesday. We have Jonathan Bowyer with us, who was so kind to agree to be basically the main figure of this webinar, to provide us with his insights, experience, and actually much more with working with 360 assessment process. But not only, Jonathan, and he will tell us that in a second, but he also is very much connected to the field that we are in, also working as a coach, as a trainer, and so on. But I will not say more. I will let Jonathan speak, and then once again ask you to remain muted, and then of course whenever you have a question, feel free then to ask. Jonathan, are you ready?
I'm ready. Hi there. Hope yeah, that's right, big wave. How are you doing? It's good to be here and see some familiar names on the list of people who are here. I think quite a few of the people who are joining are people who were on the seminar, workshop, training course, whatever it was that we did in Ireland a couple of years ago around 360s. So it's great to see how far it's kind of come since then with the Guild and the 360 and the AppRaiser. It's exciting times. So it's good to be able to kind of pop my head in and say hi and share with you some stuff and hopefully provoke some conversation. I hope we can do that. Can I just check how long we have? What's the expectation in terms of time?
We have until I'm just looking at the time, 3:30 Central European time, so about an hour. Yeah,
about an hour. Great. Okay, so let's see how we go. I prepared a few slides as much as anything else, just to give a little bit of structure to introducing things, and then hopefully, yes, it'll turn perhaps into more of a conversation, and we'll kind of see where we go. So I'm going to share my screen and see whether you can see some slides, if I can find them. There we go. And now you can see that, yeah. Suddenly all the video came to the middle of my page. Great, so there we go. I need to move the slide along. Good. Okay, so I thought I'd just introduce myself perhaps a little bit more for those who I've not met before. As you already know, I have a bit of a background in coaching and mentoring, facilitation. I say I'm on my third career. The first one was in the oil industry, second one was in adventure-based learning, and then for the last 17 or 18 years I've been working as a coach, facilitator, mentor, trainer, mainly with different types of organisation, mainly thinking about leadership. But one of the common threads that's been going through that has also been developing, running training for coaches and mentors, and occasionally for facilitators as well. So the story of me getting into 360s was that I was with a client and they'd asked for a management development program, and I said, how do you know how well your managers are doing? And they said, well, we don't. We just take it as, you know, that if there's a problem, then we'll know. And I said, have you heard of 360-degree feedback? And they said, no, tell us about it. So I told them what I knew, and long story short, came out of the meeting with a contract to run 360s and no idea how I was going to do that. So I went on SurveyMonkey and I devised a question set, and that evolved over quite a long period of time. Eventually got a software writer to create some bespoke stuff, and that's been growing and developing kind of since then, which is getting on for about 10 years. And during that time, I've used 360 as part of leadership development programs, or actually other kinds of development programs as well, team development, usually kind of before and after type assessment or appraisal. I've used it for performance review and development, so people who are doing annual appraisals. I have one client who uses a 360 every year with all of their managers to inform their annual appraisal. And it's also been used on occasion for people who are struggling in whatever it is that they're trying to do, and for their development. There's been a one-off, as it were, 360 designed specifically for the individual. It's also used occasionally at the start of a new role, people coming into a new role, and sometimes used for promotion and selection. Is this the right person to promote into a new role? So I've seen 360 used in those different ways. And of course, for trainers and for coaches, and in particular in the training context. It's been used in lots. It is used in lots of different ways, and I guess the combined knowledge of how it's used across this group is growing all the time. In the session today, I wanted to talk about kind of two kinds of relationship in relation to 360s. One is the relationship between the recipient and the respondent, and the other is between the recipient and the coach. And those words are my kind of shorthand. Recipient, the person who's receiving the 360 feedback, and the respondent, the person who's one of the people who's giving it. And then the coach, I'm thinking of the coach in the broadest sense. It could be that it's the person's boss. It could be the recipient's commissioner, the person who's commissioned you to do a piece of work. It could be a colleague or a peer, or it could be somebody independent coming in who's facilitated the whole of the 360 process, and is coming in to help with the most essential part of the 360 process, which is the interpretation of the data that's been given. So two kind of areas, and we might build this as talking about anonymity of respondents, and that's if you like, the focused area. But actually, that issue is to do with the relationship between recipient and respondent in 360s. So I'll take the first one first, and just talk for a little while about that. As I say, if anyone's got any questions, I don't know whether something will pop up on my screen at the minute, because I'm sharing my screen and all I can see is my slides. So Susanna, if you spot something, then wave at me or something, or shout at me. And we can do interrupt me with questions or comments or any other thoughts that you have as we go through. So the relationship between the recipient and the respondent, of course, is set in a context and a culture, and that might be an ongoing culture and an ongoing context, or it could be a temporary culture. In outdoor education, when I worked in outdoor education, we used to refer to a book called The Temporary Community, which kind of described what happens when you get a group of people together on a training course. So the culture that's there is important if it's in an organizational context, and of course that takes longer to grow, and probably longer and is harder to change. But the 360 and the relationship between recipient and respondent is taking place in the context of some kind of setting, some kind of culture, and more specifically, maybe within a specific team, and the culture and the expectations and the norms that are going on within that team. And then, of course, there's other stakeholders involved in this who may not be directly providers of feedback, but they may have an interest in the whole thing. If it's an organizational context, then that can be to do with suppliers or customers. In a training context, I guess the different stakeholders might be commissioners, they may be the organizations that are sending participants, and so on. And everybody has an interest in the success of the 360, and we can talk a bit perhaps about what success means in a general sense. But the idea of the culture influencing that relationship is important, and vice versa. So this question around openness, anonymity, is one that's kind of really current for me. There's one client who over the last year or so, they've been doing 360s with their exec team, and they are keen to change their culture so that it's okay to name yourself and acknowledge that you're the person who's giving this score or this comment in a 360. And some people are horrified by the idea. But what's the culture? Is the culture that you have important, or is the culture that you want more important? So the idea that if we are prepared to admit or own up to the comment that I've made or the score that I've given, could that be really helpful in terms of the ongoing relationship between recipient and respondent, but actually between all people within the organization or the team? Could it be helpful to know more about that? And of course, there's some risks around it, and there's some benefits around it. So if you think about the risks, and here's a kind of question, and it may be that people can write in the onto the Etherpad your ideas about this. I just kind of put a couple of placeholders in the Etherpad if you want to kind of write in there, but also to kind of to chip in if you think, what are the risks and what are the benefits of basically not being anonymous, let's put it that way. What are the kind of things that are coming up? And I can see people are writing stuff already. Can I read it? Is it more important to culture? Okay, so I'm going to try and read and talk at the same time, which is not always easy. Maybe actually you can unmute yourself and just throw out a couple of ideas about those risks and benefits, and let's kind of hear a few things, and then I'll talk about what's on my list if you've not covered it already. Any thoughts? Silence. I'll give you my starter for 10 then would be, in terms of risks, that people actually won't do it. That's possibly the first one. That if they know that they are going to be have their name by the comment that they make, then they may say, well, in that case, I'm not going to make my comment. There's perhaps a risk that people will abuse the opportunity and not be as thoughtful or as careful or as sensitive as they need to be when they're writing. They may not be as skilled in writing stuff that's going to have their name by it. And again, there's a confidence piece there that's going on. It may be that there's a risk around the recipient seeing the name by the comment or the score and choosing to focus in on that comment and the conversation that comes after. And that, of course, can be a benefit, but also the idea that that there could be essentially an argument going on is a risk. And yeah, it may be that risk is too big. But then what about the benefits? But before I go to the benefits, does that spark any other thoughts about why we might choose to be anonymous or not?
Hello, Jonathan.
Hey, Mark.
How are you doing?
I'm good.
Nice to see you in pink. I think a lot of these questions around anonymity, well, you know, not saying your name, is also a lot like in our practice of when we do evaluations of training courses themselves. Yeah, because the people get very horrified if you say put your name on the fucking paper, and because then they have to stand for it.
Yeah.
And the question, I mean, in addition to what you've said about language, I think the people are very afraid of especially if they're not writing in their own language, they're very afraid of writing something which could be easily misunderstood.
Yes.
So that unless you yourself have a really strong relationship with that person, and you know that you can go back to them and they can come back to you to explain more if it's needed, they're not going to say shit about how bad you are in a particular thing or how good you are in a particular thing. Well,
Yes.
they might be more, tendentially, they might be more happy to say, you're great, so you're wonderful. Well, what could I possibly say else? You know?
Yeah. Yeah, that of course points then to the structure of the questions, that, you know, that kind of broad "you're great" stuff is almost weeded out by the way in which you ask the questions. But yeah, absolutely, I totally agree about the risk of being misunderstood, whether that's because of language or you know, a kind of mismatch of understanding of jargon or that kind of stuff. In terms of then of benefits, you know, why would we do this in the first place? Why would we encourage people to put their name by a comment? I guess it is primarily comments. It's a bit harder to do technically by scores, although not impossible. So if you were to if we were to think about the benefits, then I would see, as a starter at least, that if this is being done in the context of a genuine relationship, then the idea that the honest interaction can build the relationship further is a kind of good one for me. It's also that sense, especially from an organizational perspective, and I appreciate we might not necessarily only be talking about organizational context here, but the idea that you're building a culture of feedback, a culture where honest and open feedback is the norm, could be really, you know, really very positive. I guess we might not be thinking in terms particularly of organizations, but we might be talking about networks, and openness and on honesty is useful in those too. So that would be one thing. And this kind of picking up on what someone has written, yes, it might be a risk for some people, but it's actually, I see it as a really important benefit, that if somebody has noticed something about the way that I'm delivering training or the way that I'm coaching them, then to be able to go back to them and say, you know, thank you for writing that in my 360. Can you tell me some more? Can you give me some more specific examples, or can you give me ideas about how I might do it differently? I think that can be the most useful thing from my perspective. Any thoughts from anybody else? So I wonder.
I'm wondering.
Oh, go on.
What I have to say, I'm wondering if the host can also speak and ask question. I was just, because Mark, before we started, asked, have we ever ourselves been asked to provide feedback in 360? And for me, one risk, I mean, you said a little bit about it, is really about the relationship with the person. It was a really close colleague, and then really trying to balance things and maybe even provide feedback about the areas that we've never discussed in person, because, you know, you should, if you have even a personal culture of feedback, then it should be there. But then if suddenly you are opening the areas that you've never discussed and you have a chance to give feedback, then it's really this, especially if it's not an open feedback. Yeah, so there are really choices, things to choose. Yeah, so this thing, I think, and really thinking about the personal relationship, especially if it's a really well developed one, I think for me it's quite a risk. I'm still in favor, but
yeah, it's so there's something almost about a kind of range, I guess, between not close enough, but then possibly too close. If you know, almost if you're that close to your colleague, then you don't need a 360 because you've already given the feedback directly to them. That comment about when there's choices, so a scored question or a, you know, multiple choice type thing, that's an interesting one, because I was reflecting as I was just talking earlier about whether it's a desirable thing to have scored questions attributable, or whether actually the scored ones should remain anonymous, but the written ones to be attributable, which is how the system that I've been using works at the moment. One of the other risks if you like, administratively around it, around this, is that there needs to be some kind of agreement amongst the respondents, if that's possible, about whether everyone's going to be attributable or everyone's going to be anonymous. Because what happens if there's a free choice, and my system has that at the minute, if there's a free choice, it's possible that the recipient of the feedback can see, you know, 6 people have given their names and 2 people haven't, and from what they've written, those 2 remaining suddenly become attributable by default. It becomes very easy to guess who has written what. And I find in the kind of the debriefing of 360s that people are drawn really strongly to try to work out who has said what. So in some ways, the attribution function removes that. It's like, okay, I know already. I don't need to play the game. I can just I can just now understand. Yeah, this person thinks this about me. This person thinks this about me. I think another risk is that if we have people who are, if you like, more influential, or whose opinion we value more right from the start because we have a closer relationship, or because you know, they are the person who's going to give us more work, or you know, whatever it happens to be, then we may put more weight on their feedback than we do on people who we don't know as well. And there's a risk that we might miss something, or we might skew our opinion. I sometimes describe 360s as both a snapshot and a panorama. So as a snapshot, it's kind of a moment in time. It's a group of people, their view. They may not be a group, but they are there's a set of individuals who are giving their view a moment in time. And when you take that as a whole, when you take it in the round, then you get general senses of how you're doing. The feedback comments then enable you to kind of unpick that a little bit, but the risk is that it actually puts some parts of the panorama into focus and brings other parts of the panorama out of focus, and that's not always helpful, I would say. So there's a real balancing act, and I guess there's some discussion that could be had around in a training context. So if I think of 360-degree feedback for trainers who are you know, they've been doing some training over a period of time perhaps, and the participants are invited, and the commissioners are invited, and other stakeholders are invited to give feedback. To what extent do they all get the culture? To what extent are they equipped to give that attributed feedback in a way that will kind of work and hang together with all the other pieces of feedback? It's just another kind of thought about it, really.
Jonathan, in the chat, we have another question from Mark, and he says that he thinks that the power relations are very important there. And yeah, what if 360 means that you will or will not get employed? Or be employed?
Yeah, I guess that's what I was alluding to. If somebody who is giving feedback, if their particular view skews your response to the feedback, and of course, if it's skewed that, oh, right, well, I better do this in a particular way because that's what the commissioner of the next piece of work, the next employer is going to appreciate, then it becomes a waste of time doing it as a 360. You may as well just have that conversation with that individual. And it comes back to that idea that this is it's a panorama of views, and we have to be able to see all of the picture and draw then from it whatever it is that we want to draw from that, without being worried about whether what the impact is going to be in terms of future work. And that comes that kind of fits with something that we'll talk about later on with the way that we debrief or process the 360 reports that we receive. Any other thoughts about that kind of that relationship between the recipient and the respondent, or as it says there, recipient and respondent? Sorry about that typo. It's interesting to think, just again, I'm reflecting out loud here, but it's interesting to consider what the culture is within a team of trainers, about how they feed back to one another. When we did the, I think we did it for the Guild kind of pilot 360, and we may have done it on Trace as well, that we definitely did it with the Trace 360, that we separated out different groups. So immediately it was a bit harder to be anonymous in that setting. So there was a group of peers, co-trainers as it were, a group of participants, and a group of other interested stakeholders like the organisations and commissioners. But if you think about in particular the peers working together, 360 might be seen as a summary of the conversations that we've had as trainers as we've been working together. And if we have a feedback culture within our trainers team, I'm not sure how common that is, but it'd be interesting to kind of reflect on it. Is it appropriate? Is it useful? Is it the best thing to do to be giving one another feedback as we go along? I stopped doing late night, wine or whiskey filled sessions where we chatted about the end of about the day that had just gone in any great detail. But I guess those things those meetings kind of still happen, and I wonder whether they are times when actually feedback is going on normally, and whether that's a good thing, or whether it's a useful thing, or whether actually taking more time to reflect and having structure might be more beneficial. We're kind of thinking about that kind of subculture that exists within the trainers team.
I'm not sure if you can see the chat, but there is also
okay.
There are some comments coming in. So we have from Ben, from Sergio, and from Tommy. So do you see, or would you prefer me to read them?
Yeah, no, I've got it here. Just let me see if I can get.
Super.
Okay, so I'll go from the bottom up, I think. Jonathan, would you say that attribution or anonymity should be completely free option choice in 360 processes, or is it better to set or recommend a default? I think my answer to that goes back to the idea that if some do it and some don't, then the ones who don't suddenly find themselves by default losing their anonymity. So if there's some way, and I've not thought about how you do this, but if there's some way of getting agreement before you start to say, is this going to be anonymous or is it not going to be anonymous? Of course, in the end, respondents to 360s have a choice. They get sent an invitation. They can always say no. So if the recipient says that that this is going to be an attributed 360, your name will appear by your comments, then they can choose to not do it. So yeah, rather than a default, I would probably say a choice and an agreement up front, and make that really, really clear. And if enough people say we're not going to be attributed, then maybe you switch it off for everybody. But yeah, the conversation beforehand is important. I normally recommend that recipients of the feedback put together their list of respondents, and then have a chat with their manager or an appropriate colleague in that way to kind of sense check who's on the list and who's not on the list. And it may be that what we need to do is to add to that the conversation about whether this should be attributed or anonymous. The next question up there: personally, I prefer to allow others and myself initial space for reflection, as I need to be ready to receive feedback. Yeah, let's come back to that in a little while when we talk about what we do with our feedback. And then the next one up: culture of feedback on the trainers field. It should be further developed from my perspective. In some colleagues, I noticed some resistance to it. Yeah, it can be really scary. It can be really scary to receive feedback from your colleagues. What do you think I feel like doing a presentation with you lot today? It's that kind of the resistance, again, another conversation around why might we be resistant, and how do we break down the resistance? How do we make it safe? So with the organization that we've been doing, that I've been doing attributed feedback with this last year, these are pretty senior people in a large NGO, not-for-profit health organization. And one of the ways that we have reduced the fear is by running training workshops for as many people in the organization as possible on what good feedback is. So the whole thing about it being specific, about it being timely, about it being constructive, enabling people to do something with it. Ask people the purpose of feedback in the first place. Why are we doing any kind of feedback? It's so that we can raise our awareness and then choose or have choices about what we do differently next time. So again, if we can get that, and that goes back to Mark's comment about evaluation. When we're doing evaluation, if people don't understand why it's being done, if they just see it as a tick box, we have to do this because it's required or it's supposedly good practice, then we're not likely to get the best out of people from that perspective. Going a bit further up, yeah, for me it's the way we view the feedback as a personal attack or a professional advice. Yeah, again, it comes down to the relationship with the respondent. I see another chat's come in from Mark again. Feedback during a training course, very different from 360. It can be really useful if you can identify a burning issue for yourself now, so that your colleagues know what to observe or help you with. They have enough going on already in a way. Still, a bit of extra effort can be really productive. The luxury of having somebody observing you training is, I think, is really precious thing. It's a really valuable thing, especially if you've got a framework, whether it's a competence framework or the question set that you might later use in the 360, that somebody observing you can refer to and kind of say, yeah, I'm noticing that this competence is being demonstrated here, or this competence is not being demonstrated here, and maybe it was an opportunity to do so. I think that's great, but like you say, Mark, there's a lot on already. We're usually thinking about what the next session is that we're running. Organisation I worked with long time ago, 15, 18 years ago, we actually occasionally would have an extra person who wasn't delivering training with that team, but would come in for one day or a half day and give us feedback pretty much live. They'd observe the sessions like they do in schools. Teachers being assessed, they have people coming in and observing what we do and giving feedback straight off. But it's against something, and that's the structure that, if you like, it's a value added that we might take from 360s, that if you've got a great question set or competence framework that you can use for 360, but you can use it in other settings as well. I'm wondering if we should move on to the next section. Getting a thumbs up there. So remembering which button to press on my computer. Oh, it's there, that's right. So what about the relationship between the recipient and the coach? That's really weird. There's another "and" just appeared again as well. That wasn't there to start with. Anyway, same kind of three, exactly the same 3 bullet points, but a different question. The relationship between the recipient and the coach is influenced by and has an influence on the context and the culture, the nature of the team, and who the other stakeholders are. When I kind of think about who might be the coach, who are the people who might be helping a recipient of 360 to process it, they could actually be, there could be a range of people. They could be the boss, there could be the commissioner, they could be a colleague, a peer, or they could be an independent, external, third-party person, kind of helping people to process. They could be the senior trainer or the lead or whatever it is. And of course, there's a risk of a power relationship influencing the conversation there as well. I guess ideally, in the setting of the guild in particular, then perhaps we're thinking primarily about a peer-to-peer, colleague-to-colleague, mutual, same level, no hierarchy type relationship. I get ideally good coaches are able to kind of form that the good coaches would not have a sense of a power relationship, and the rapport that's created by whoever it is obviously really crucial to that. So what's the role, what's the purpose of the coach? Again, might be really interesting to see what people think about that, and maybe put it most easily into the chat. You know, if we're trying to define our role, if we are the person who is helping somebody when they receive their 360, what is it that we're supposed to be doing? For me, it goes back to that idea of raising awareness, helping people process the data and squeeze the juice out of what has been collected. You know, the 360 on its own is just a set of data, and data, of course, can be skewed, it can be poorly presented, it can be kind of used in ways that it wasn't ever intended for. So I see the role of the coach is to help the recipient to work that through, work out what it is that they can take from the data. It may also be to develop the skill, the sustainable, ongoing, repeated skill of interpreting feedback generally. You know, the 360 is that moment in time, snapshot, panorama. Then the skill that we use to interpret that could be transferable into other times when we receive feedback from other people. Again, whether that's on the hoof in the training, or offered, invited or uninvited at different times, close to the training, at the end of a series of training, or just when you happen to meet up sometime. So it could be a transferable skill. So for me, that thing of raising awareness, and then what are you going to do with the awareness is crucial. So it's the challenge. I would argue that in terms of, you know, best fulfilling the role, like any great coach, will be asking wonderful questions, powerful questions, and will be listening and noticing the responses and the reactions. So the questions may be questions that are around the data. So what are you noticing about the data? Or they might be about the options for the future use of the data that's come through. So it's almost like, let's together question the data. And that brings to mind, I don't know if people come across the idea in dealing with difficult conversations, dealing with conflict resolution conversations, that we often use the tool of the third point of contact. I always originally thought third point of contact was a really useful thing when you're rock climbing. Always have 3 points of contact, but the third point of contact in this setting is often a document, whether it's a policy or a strategy or a 360-degree feedback report. And if you imagine that two people are having a conversation, but one of them is feeling really nervous about what they're about to receive, and they may have read it through, and they're actually, that nervousness has been confirmed or endorsed, and suddenly they've got to process it, and there's another human being interacting with them about it. Having a document, whether it's on a screen or on a piece of paper, that the two of you can look at together, and I don't know if you can see my gesticulations here, but that idea that our eyes focus on a third point of contact rather than the difficulty of the eye-to-eye conversation, that can be really quite powerful. So the idea that we ask great questions of the data, and together we're doing that, focusing in on what's it saying, and there's some skills around if you've got graphs, if you've got images, if you've got word clouds, if you've got a range of different ways of presenting the data, then often that can be a bit bewildering for people, and it can be quite difficult to kind of work your way through. So ideally, the 360 coach is somebody who is really confident with looking at the different styles of presentation of data, and helping the coachee, in this case a 360 recipient, to interpret what's going on. So there's the data bit, and then there's the human bit, as it were, and the conversation, the asking questions of the individual. So now you've seen this data, and now you're starting to interpret this data. What does that mean for you? What are you noticing about it? But also, what are you noticing about your reaction to it? There's a couple of questions that in coach training we often kind of say or offer as questions when you're stuck as a coach, but they may not only for when you're stuck. And the idea of asking the question, what would you like to be asked now, and what would you not like to be asked now about what you're seeing in your report, can be quite a powerful kind of question. But I'm wondering what other questions you've used in your assessment, or had used on you in your receiving of 360s. Any kind of thoughts on that? While you're thinking what you might say, I'll have a look at what's come in the chat. There's a question about the third point of contact. Can it be a person? I think yes, it can in general circumstances, but it depends how independent that person is. In the context of 360, the reason for mentioning it was that the report itself is the third point of contact. You've got it there, and you can refer to it in that way. That was my thinking there. So what are the killer questions that you would find useful either as the coach or the recipient of a 360 report? No thoughts?
Jonathan, do you think you can maybe give an example of a question, and then maybe that sparks the ideas?
Sure. Okay. So standard a go-to sort of progression of questions that I might normally go with, and I think we use this with Trace, was the question that first actually says, what are your general impressions? You've got a bunch of data. You may have gone through it page by page. You may have skimmed it. You may have just looked at the word clouds and the graphs. But what's your general impression? And see what that brings out. And of course, if you're the coach, you've probably read it. I would say that's pretty good practice to have read the report. Brings another question about anonymity, though, confidentiality. Should your coach be receiving your report the same time as you, a little bit after you, just when you get in the conversation about it? It's worth considering. But yeah, what are your general impressions about the data that you've received? What are you all noticing? And then I might say, what are you most pleased about? And then what are you disappointed or concerned about? So those are the, if you like, the more awareness raising type questions that I would go with. Very simple and straightforward. And then I might go from that to so which areas would be most appropriate, most useful for you to be working on right now? If you've got the luxury of several conversations, then you might be able to do you might take a section at a time or a page at a time. But I guess again, this transferability of the the skill of processing the data can mean that you might focus on one area in your conversation and encourage your recipient of feedback to go away and process the rest on their own, or with a colleague, with another peer. I like the idea someone, Mark's just put up about, what surprised you the most as another awareness raiser. And then the questions about what next, for me, would flow out of the specific areas of focus that the recipient wants to focus on. Getting them to decide what is the focus area might take a bit more probing. Some people will come up with it straight away. Other people will need a bit of help, and it may be that you say, what's the area? If you look at your own response, most 360s have their, the individual's own response in there. Where is the most congruent, or where's the biggest gap? And that could be an area to kind of focus in on. What's the competence area that you're going to particularly need the next time you're working in this field? That might be another area to focus on. So those kind of questions to draw out, right, that's going to be the focus. And then I might go into questions around, well, okay, so what does it, what's the actual data in this area saying? If it's giving you a score out of 3 or 4 out of 10, for example, then what is it that's giving you 3 or 4 and not 1 or 2? That kind of solutions focused approach to say, let's focus in on what you are doing well and how can you grow more of it. That might be an approach, rather than the approach that says, what's the worst thing, what's the most offensive bit of feedback I've got, or the most upsetting bit of feedback I've got in this report, and just dealing with that. That may not be the best place to go. Might not help with the confidence. Might not help with the kind of attitude that says, I actually, overall this is pretty good feedback, or overall there's a lot of stuff that I can take to be positive. Yeah, so I'm looking at the chat again. What would you not like to be asked? Yeah, I use that question occasionally, and it's a good one for just sometimes stopping people in their tracks. Yeah, there's a question from Ben about would I ask why? Why do you think someone has given you that feedback? I'm always a bit nervous about the question why. It's it can be taken as this kind of quite interrogative and sometimes a bit aggressive kind of a question. But we can ask the question why in more subtle ways. So in principle, yes, I think I would occasionally ask why, but I'd ask it in terms of, what do you think is behind that question? What evidence is being given? And is that sufficient evidence for you to take this piece of feedback seriously? And if it's not sufficient evidence, or if there is none, then I might ask the recipient to talk about, well, what could be behind it? If they've not specified, if the comment section at the end of the, after the graph doesn't help to interpret a low score, for example, then I might get someone to think, well, what could be behind that? And is that real, or is that just a piece of your imagination? So those would be the kinds of questions, and then I would obviously then be leading into, so what are you going to do about this? You've received this feedback, you're interpreting it, it's raised your awareness. What is there that you would do differently next time, or new next time? What is it that you need to go and read up on, or and that kind of thing? Again, looking at chat, I know this is usually not the case in coaching, but what do you do if the recipient asks you for your opinion about the feedback they got and insists on an answer? So I'm not allowed to fudge that one, Mark. I think that I would, I'd be interested to know why I wasn't invited to give feedback in the first place. And if the reason for that is that because I've not seen them delivering training or whatever it is that the feedback's about, then I would refer very much to the data. I would use the data and say, I can give you my opinion about what this data might be saying, but in the same way as it is for the recipient, so it is more so for the coach, that we are only able to use the data that's in front of us. So I would be wanting to, if I'm looking at scores, for example, I'd be looking at patterns, and then I'd be looking at the comments that are made. This is a real really good example of why, when we're asking people to score questions, we also ask them we need to ask them to explain their scores if they're particularly high or particularly low. I would say to give examples for whatever score they gave. The more examples people can give, the better. And it's where, in my experience, it's where recipients of feedback go to. Yes, they might look at the graph to get the general impression, but they're very interested every time in the written comments. So
Jonathan,
my opinion. No, so go ahead.
Yeah, if I can have a question, it's related to also the project that brought us here with the webinar and so on. And in this case, this follow-up, or rather the looking at the feedback and interpreting the feedback, somehow the idea is to have a trio support. Yeah, so not to have like a signed coach, but actually kind of a support and a little group that would follow this process. Do you have any experiences with that maybe you could share, or something that you would?
No more than you have. Of the trio, I love the idea of it, but it goes back to the culture. Again, are we creating culture, or are we responding to the culture that exists? But that idea that if I were the recipient of a 360 feedback, that there would be a colleague who is perhaps working more closely with me when I'm delivering training, and then a third party who is perhaps more objective. I can see that working really well. I could imagine if you've got recipient, coach, and third person, I can imagine the third person having part of their role as being to notice what's going on in the conversation between the recipient and the coach. That makes sense, and feed that into the conversation. So I notice, I could imagine a coach saying, a third person saying, I notice when the coach points you to this, you always, frown, or I notice when the coach highlights this, that you always smile, or I notice you didn't answer the coach's question in that particular thing. That kind of feedback can be, it's process feedback as much as it is feedback about the feedback, if you see what I mean. I'm seeing another comment coming in. If there's an insistence on an answer, does this open the door to a question back to the participant about their motivation for asking you? Yeah. Why do you want my opinion? Yeah, I'm just the independent coach. Yeah, and again, it's there's always a balancing act, I guess, between having a coach with real independence and objectivity, and being really, that person being really focused on process, and the credibility that a coach has when they know what the context is that you're from. And it kind of strays also into that debate also strays into the difference between a coach and a mentor. Is it actually, is the person who's helping you process your 360-degree feedback report more like a mentor if they are if they've had a 360 themselves, the same 360? Does that change the dynamic? And I don't think there's one right answer, but it'd be really interesting to gather people's experiences and see in the context of trainers and the guild what works best for that group of people. So I think I've kind of come to the end of the points that I was going to try and raise and the questions I was going to try and raise. I've not had a chance to look at the Etherpad for a while, so I don't know what's been written there. But I'm open to any other questions. Don't know how we are. I've not looked to see how much time we've got. About 3 minutes by my clock, if we're going to stay within the hour. But happy to take any other questions or just open the debate up.
There's one.
There's one. Having in mind the goal 360 in youth work trainers world and trainers regularly, is there a question that you think we must ask others through 360? Oh, that's a really hard question. A must ask question. Yeah, thanks, Marcus. Why are you doing this? Yeah, why are you doing this? What's your motivation? I guess it's, so the idea that comes to my mind is not so much a specific individual question, but actually the result of asking the same question of the trainer, the 360 recipient, as you ask of all the recipients, so that whatever the question is, the recipient, the trainer, has already reflected on what their answer is. And again, if the report is presented well, then it will show the trainer's view alongside the views of everybody else. Because, you know, one of those interpretive things is to do with is the comparisons. So what's the spread of views across the 360? Where are the peaks and troughs, and how do all of those compare with what you thought about yourself when you were reflecting in the privacy of your own home, kind of thing? What is it that hits you? What do you notice about the similarities and the differences? So that's in the interpretation end. But if you've not asked the question if you've not asked each question of the trainer themselves, then it's kind of hard to do it in the moment, I would say.
Thank you, Jonathan. Wow, okay. So we had two more, and one was from Tommy. Where would you like us to begin? Which I assume is the question also for the beginning of the coaching session. And then from Mark, how was working with the Guild on 360 different from working with other groups? So if you could briefly just reflect on those, and then we would.
Okay, so the question about where would you like us to begin absolutely is a question that I would, I would like in the context of reviewing the feedback, but it relies on the coachee, the recipient of the feedback, to have really studied and actually spent quite a bit of time already looking at their feedback. And that may or may not be the case. And it links into my answer to Mark's final question about how working with the Guild differed from with other groups, in that I understand that in the Guild, the trainer is choosing to do a 360. And because they're choosing, because they've chosen to kind of engage, it's part of their own CPD activity, they're likely to have studied it. They're likely to be very interested in what is going to be, what they're going to find out in their 360. My experience of working with other groups is that the vast majority of them are working in the context of an organisation, and so. As I started with right at the beginning, actually, very often it's part of a program of development. They're going to do workshops and coaching and action learning sets and things like that over maybe a period of a year. So having a 360 at the beginning and at the end is really helpful for kind of measuring growth and development. So that's perhaps more the organizational context is perhaps the biggest difference. Of course, I guess Guild members using this will also choose to do a 360 periodically. Again, big question about how often. Depends a lot on how much training you're doing and whether you feel like you're changing things or growing and developing. That's kind of, that's my answer. If I had more time, I'd perhaps reflect on some other answers. But
yeah, I think Sergio really, he already, thank you for your time and knowledge and sharing, which I can just echo. This was really brilliant. So thank you so much for taking your time. You mentioned Etherpad. It's full. I mean, also the note takers. which were a few, and Jan and Mike did a great job.
Thank you.
So thanks again. I would just invite, if that's okay, Jan, if he's ready, just to give us maybe 2 lines of the updates of what is happening with the AppRaiser, which is somehow the framework of all this. So Jan, and a lot of thank yous coming also in the chat for you, Jonathan. So Jan, if you are ready to give us a bit of an update.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, great, because I kind of messed around with 2 different sources, the computer and the phone, since the computer didn't have a webcam. Yes, I really will take just a couple of minutes. Well, first of all, hi, John. It's been quite a while since we've seen each other personally.
Great to see you.
But concerning AppRaiser, and I was going through the list of the participants today, and I think some of the participants might not know much of the project, but it's going to be very short, my introduction to the project, because I would like to get straight to how, if anybody is interested, how they could get involved at this stage of the project. But anyway, it's a K-Action 2 that was inspired by that training we had in Ireland that you mentioned at the beginning, and by the decision of the Guild to implement 360s. And starting from that, it developed into a project wanting to produce an outcome that could go to become something useful, a tool for all the trainers interested in self-assessment or collecting external feedback. And as a matter of fact, in this stage, we have ended the first test of the introductory part of the platform, the part that will allow people to create their account and to be involved into the into the using and further development of the tool. And we are going now toward developing the features for the self-assessment, and later on there will be the features for the collecting feedback and so on. The specific level of engagement from interested stakeholders could be on at least 3 different possibilities. The first one, and the simplest one, being available to be contacted for running a test of the platform as it has been developed so far, a test that would allow us to fine-tune it, and especially for what concerns usability and the trainer's needs, collecting their impressions on how it works, what's missing, what's not clear. It has already helped us in improve a lot from the very first drafts, but there is still plenty of need for these tests. They usually run for about an hour, and they are coached by one of the people involved in the project. And in case of availability, we would reach out, and we can do it even through Skype. Later on in autumn, we will start to do the same kind of tests, but more on the self-assessment part. And it will still be both a test of the interface, but also of the features of it. And then finally, toward the end of the year, if anybody would want to take part in the training that we will promote in next March in Ireland, it will be a staff training on the use of the tool. With a few months of advance, there will be the chance to do a testing of the full tool, also in practice. So testing it in real trainings with real participants, and checking in a much deeper way how it's working, and then from there building on the content for the training course. So this is pretty much what we are, at which stage we are now, and the possible ways for people to interact with us.
Thanks, Jan. And thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, everyone, and thank you for staying also with us over time. And that's it for today. So have a great day, and have some great 360 assessments in your future.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jonathan. Bye-bye.